Thank you so much for coming back to the first day of London Conference. I'm Kate Spiliopoulos, Head of Events at Centre for London. And as a reminder, if you're going to be tweeting about this event, please use the hashtag LUNCONF20, that's LONCONF 20, to follow the discussion and help other people see what you've said. If you're in the Zoom webinar, you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit questions for our panelists or to upvote questions you think are particularly good. Earlier today, we opened the conference with a keynote speech from Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, and a presentation from Director for Centre for London, Ben Rogers, on the past 30 years of London's history and how they're still affecting what possible futures London's looking at right now. You can see all of that on YouTube. But for this session, we're going to be going much further back into London's history and asking how London as a global city comes to terms with its history of being a center for the transatlantic slave trade and British colonialism. How do we represent that history in our public realms, in our schools, and in our museums? And what's the difference between honoring and remembering, as well as asking what monuments might be missing from our streets? In just a moment, we're going to start the panel and we're going to have Sharon Ament, who is the director of Museum of London, chairing. I think she's been at another museums conference this morning, so maybe she can report back on what's happening over there. But to start out this session, we're going to have an introductory remark from Blue Badge Guide, Dominic Burris-North. And he's going to talk just a little bit to set us out about how he interacts with these sorts of statues and monuments in the course of his day-to-day work, and how he feels about them as somebody who interprets this history for the public and as someone who's a Black Londoner. So Dominic, welcome to the London Conference stage. Dominic, I think you're still muted.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Thanks very much, Kate. Thank you for inviting me to talk today, and hello, everybody. So my name is Dominic Burris-North, and I'm a professional London Blue Badge tour guide since 2016. I have been delivering tours about London's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade since 2014, so 2 years before becoming a professional guide. And that was in my capacity as a host at the Museum of London Docklands. I had encountered the Museum of London Docklands just by chance the year prior to actually becoming employed by them in 2013. And I stumbled across their London Sugar and Slavery Gallery, just by chance. What I saw in that gallery truly opened my eyes. It was something that caused a lot of dismay, shock and horror. I had always known about British involvement in the transatlantic slave trade, but I didn't know the depths to which we were involved, our city and by extension, our country. And one of the key things I took away from that visit, that first visit to the London Sugar and Slavery Gallery, was the fundamental connection between the transatlantic slave trade and racism as it is manifested today in the 21st century. So it started me off on a quest to get to grips and to do my own reckoning with this history, which after all is my own family's history. So I started off on this quest. And the more I got into it, the more I realized that across the land, up and down the land, there were institutions in our city and in our country that were intricately involved in it, both its development and propagation. So I started the tours because I felt that our city and country's role that it played in transatlantic slave trade wasn't fully acknowledged, nor was it being fully addressed. I think that there are so many places, really, it's hard to sort of get to grips with it, but I do fundamentally feel that we need to address this history. So on my tour, which focuses in on the City of London, I talk about places such as the Bank of England, which was fundamental to underpinning the system of credit and capital of the transatlantic slave trade. I talk about the vested interests of officials who worked for the City of London Corporation, Lord Mayors, Aldermen, Sheriff, all who had their fingers in the pie of slavery. I talk about some of the places where slave traders would have met, such as the Jamaica Coffee House, today the Jamaica Wine House down St. Michael's Alley in the City of London. And I also make sure that we honor and remember the millions of victims that were caught up in this most evil and tragic of human crimes. So that's where I'm coming from at this. And whilst I said this is my personal family history, I do strongly believe that it is a shared history among all Britons, in fact, amongst all people that were in some way, shape or form connected to the entity that was the British Empire. And I feel strongly that it should be better understood, better acknowledged, and its links to to racism that we have today need to be assessed critically. So when it comes to statues, I'm going to share my screen if that's possible. Just do that now. Let's start talking about some statues that I talk about on my tours. So I have a very strong feeling about some of the statues I'm going to be talking about, particularly ones like this one. This is the statue of John Cass. John Cass was a prominent member of the Royal African Company, one of the the leading slave trading company in the entirety of the period of transatlantic slavery. It was responsible for the enforced trafficking of over 200,000 enslaved Africans, over 40,000 of whom perished in the dreaded Middle Passage, which was the crossing from Africa to the Americas. And John Cass was one of the figures who was central to its operations. As a member of its courts of assistance, basically its executive board in the early 1700s, he would have been intricately involved in dealing with slave trading agents and factors in Africa and in the Americas and in the Caribbean. So when I look at this statue of John Cass, which sat, past tense, on Drury Street in the City of London, outside the John Cass Foundation, named in his honor because money from his slave trading enterprise went to founding the John Cass Foundation. When I look at it, all I see is the misery and pain that his actions caused. I'm pleased to say that the statue was removed earlier this year in light of considerations made in light of the Black Lives Matter movement of this year following the brutal murder of George Floyd. And this is what it looks like right now. Moving on, we still have some statues. Now, this is outside of my area, but this is a statue of Robert Jeffrey. It's in Hackney. It's on the almshouses that today, or the former almshouses that today house the Museum of the Home, formerly the Jeffrey Museum. Robert Jeffrey, like John Cass, was intricately involved in not only the Royal African Company, but the exploitative East India Company. He personally had involvement and ownership of a slave ship called the China Merchant. And similarly, when I look at this statue, I see somebody who caused misery for millions. And the statue remains in place today outside the Museum of the Home. There was a consultation, public consultation carried out by the trustees of the museum earlier this year, but despite the very strong feeling and numerous people that came forward to protest and ask for the statue's removal, it remains in place. Similarly, William Beckford, whose statue is inside the Guildhall, the centre, administrative centre and headquarters of the City of London Corporation, a man who owned 3,000 enslaved Africans who toiled for him and worked for him across 13 of his sugar plantations on the island of Jamaica. He sits being glorified inside the City of London's Guildhall, unquestioned, unchallenged, and I don't think that's right, and I think he should be removed. Now we come to the statue of Queen Anne. Queen Anne's not a figure that's usually associated with slavery. A year or two ago, a film called The Favourite came out, contextualizing her life and looking at an aspect that had often been overlooked, the aspect that explored the possibility that she may have been one of Britain's first queer queens. But I think that Britons have a right to know that she was also involved in the transatlantic slave trade. In 1713, the hoarding was taken down off the original of this version of this statue to coincide with an event of national thanksgiving that took place inside St. Paul's Cathedral, in front of which it stands, to commemorate the ending of the War of Spanish Succession and the resulting peace treaty of Utrecht. From this peace treaty, Britain gained considerable territorial prizes such as Gibraltar and Minorca, but also gained what was considered the El Dorado of commerce of its day, the Asiento. And the Asiento was a contract with Spain to send trade goods to the Spanish Americas in what we call South America, Central America today. And the most lucrative of these so-called trade items was human beings from Africa. Queen Anne was allocated 22.5% of the stock of the newly formed South Sea Company, which was formed to conduct this trade and to engage in this trade. And I think that it's wrong that we don't know about this. Now, as a head of state and as a former queen, I understand that it's a thorny issue to discuss the removal of a statue of somebody like Queen Anne. I should also point your attention to the fact that underneath Queen Anne there, you can see representations of an early English-British empire. On the picture on the right, you have an image wearing a headdress of a Native American woman. I think that we need to provide context, at the very least, to statues like Queen Anne. We have a right to know. And I think without an understanding and a contextualization of our past, we can't move forward as a country. We need to understand where we came from in order to understand where we are going. With that said, I will pass on back to Kate.
Thanks, Dominic. And now we'll hear from Sharon.
Hello, everybody. Well, and thank you, Dominic, indeed. You know, Dominic is here. We've just heard the power of museums and the power of exhibitions and the power of considered insight and analysis. In our case, we put this forward in as an exhibition, but our panelists do this day in and day out, and the power of evidence and the power of argument to help people navigate the world in which they live is espoused with Dominic. So it's great. Thank you, Dominic. You've said a couple of things to us, that people have a right to know and that it's about contextualizing and understanding. And you put that very powerfully and highlighted some of the physical evidence of history in the statues around us. And this comes at a really important moment. You know, the Mayor of London has commissioned a report into or a consideration of diversity in the public realm, and Debbie is integrally involved in that and leading on that. The City of London itself, which Dominic has cited as being obviously implicated in the history of slavery, has itself started to open consultation on its historic landmarks. And for me, if that doesn't mark a moment of change, I don't know what does. Now, our panelists are extraordinary people, and they all have something in common when you read their biographies. Their work, their professions, their attitudes and what they are striving for are all rooted in a kind of an evidence-based approach. And that for me is really important in the context of the world today, when there are so many countervailing winds against evidence. And what a week for us to talk about evidence and how we approach our history. All of our panelists are extremely passionate, are extremely good at communicating, and they have they're using their approach to effect positive change. And whilst I don't know for sure, I I do know that from what some of our panelists have said, their own lived experience has affected their lives and their approach to their professional careers. And we may hear some of that today. So we have Sunder, who is the director of British Future, an independent, non-partisan think tank. You, Sunder, were a journalist to begin with and was the General Secretary of the Fabian Society. And like thinking back to an earlier conversation today in this conference where London, the perceptions of London from those who live outside of London or born outside of London is very personal. Sunder is from Doncaster. And has raised in all sorts of fora the whole question of racism and integration and the power of our continual dialogue. And I was very interested to see to see in Conservative Home in 2016 your view of the Enoch Powell Rivers of Blood speech and its power across the ages. Very interesting. And I believe that now, as you are looking at the issues facing our society in relation to the COVID and the pandemic, and how you are considering this in, as you term, a decade of reconnection for our society beyond COVID. This is a really important, we have our collective jobs set out for us. It's big, important, and quite exciting too. Debbie Weeks-Bernard is the Deputy Mayor of Social Integration, Social Mobility and Community Engagement. What a great big long title, Debbie. And again, going back to that evidence-based approach, she leads the promotion of equalities and active citizenship across London and makes sure that, that City Hall actively seeks to tackle poverty for Londoners across all groups. She was formerly of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and the Runnymede Trust, building through evidence-based research to inform policy. Her interests span education, poverty, ethnicity, and she really has been at the sharp end of the current circumstance by being a governor in schools. And if there can't be a more difficult time for schools and the leadership within schools than at this moment in time. And then we have David Olusoga, who you may know very well, who was also kind of grown up outside of London, and so brings that perspective to us and our conversation in the Centre for London, the London conference here today. He is the Professor of Public History at the University of Manchester. I absolutely love his work. A House Through Time is extraordinary. I think David is the personification of what a museum should be, in that he delves deeply, he brings new insight, evidence and analysis, draws connection, exposes people to new ideas and new ways of thinking about the past, so that they can reflect on the circumstances, their personal circumstances perhaps today. And he does it in a way which is totally entertaining and hugely compelling. That's why I think he's like Mr. Museum in human form. So that's our panel. We are waiting to see questions pop up. So keep them coming in thick and fast. And I'm going to open up the questions. So if the panel can turn their microphones on, then I think we'll have more of a communication and conversation rather than kind of a stilted thing. So, to you all, what on earth is it about 2020 that has sparked this debate about our physical history. And I know many of us have been screaming into the void, it seems, for many years. You've all been working on this in one form or other. What is it about 2020 that has created this passion? And what does this debate tell us about racial inequality and social integration in London today? And I am going to ask Debbie to give us her first thoughts on that.
Thank you so much, Sharon. It's always scary to be the first one to go, but this is definitely something that I've certainly been thinking about, largely because obviously, as you've mentioned before, the Mayor of London announced on the 9th of June that we were going to start a commission on diversity in the public realm. Which is a piece of work that I'm leading with Justine Simons, who's the Deputy Mayor for Culture and Creative Industries. And it's effectively our attempt to help to kick off, facilitate the discussion about how we can better represent the diversity of our city in our public realm, in our monuments, in our statues, in our squares, street names, etc. The reason that I think that it's so timely, however, is obviously because we're in a clearly unprecedented set of situations. This has been a very unusual year, very challenging time. But I think what is really interesting about the timing of all of this is that we're having a discussion about contested cultural heritage, about how we can better represent that diversity, whether or not we need to add to our public realm or take away from our public realm. And that has become a very heated and fairly divisive set of conversations. The issue, however, remains that it's interesting that we're having conversations about contested heritage at a time when obviously we are facing an imminent second national lockdown. We're in the middle of clearly the second wave of a pandemic, which has really disproportionately impacted upon the very people who are not represented within our public spaces. So we know it's had a hugely negative impact on both the lives and the livelihoods of Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups, of disabled groups, of women economically, and also of those on some of the lowest incomes. Yet when representatives from all of these groups wander around our city, a city in which we speak 300 languages, they do not see themselves represented. And our statues and our memorials reflect Victorian Britain, and they don't reflect either the contribution made by those from those diverse groups, or indeed some of the very different ways in which they are part and parcel of the fabric of our society. So I think the timing definitely represents sort of a coming together of the way in which many communities have fared terribly during this pandemic, but also everything that arose out of the global protests in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement, the arguments and the fights for racial and social justice, which emanated from all of that, but also recognizing that there were many, many groups and individuals, academics, organizations who had been arguing for better representation, not just in public spaces, but also in our school curricula, and also across a broader area than just our public realm, in our labour markets, in our public institutions. So this is about the emblematic nature of our statues, which is one thing, but it's also about recognising that racial and social injustice impacts upon particular groups, which leads them to seek justice in the way in which they are represented, which they clearly cannot see and factually is not there for anyone to see. And the timing, I think, is really representative of all of that.
Thank you. David, you've spoken out a lot about the Colston statue in Bristol. Your thoughts on this particular question now?
Well, I think what's happened in 2020 is that people have begun to learn what statues are and what they're not. And what they're not is history. They're not a mechanism for the delivery of history. They're a way in which our ancestors both memorialized but also validated the actions of great men. It almost always is men. The vast majority of the statues are men. There are more statues of Queen Victoria than all other named women put together. And this myth that statues are history and that we learn from them, that they are a delivery system of historical knowledge, and that removing them is somehow to rewrite history. I think that myth, a lot of people have come to understood is nonsense in 2020. And Colston was the perfect example. And in some ways, I mean, I'm delighted that Colston statue is no longer standing there. I think it should have been taken down 30 years ago rather than pulled down this year. But I'm delighted that it's down, because it's in some ways the perfect case, because it said nothing about the history of Edward Colston. It didn't even tell us what he looked like, because we have no idea what he looked like. He died in 1721. The statue was erected in 1895. The statue told us nothing at all about the Royal Africa Company that Dominic mentioned earlier, of which Colston was the deputy governor, a shareholder, a board member. Says nothing about the 80,000 people who were transported into slavery during his tenure, the 19,000 we estimate who died during his tenure. And it said untruths. I mean, not only was it lying by omission, it was directly lying. It said the statue was erected by public subscription, as if the people of 1895 Bristol, most of whom were trying to keep their bodies and soul together and just trying to get enough to eat, cared about a 17th century slave trader. The statue was paid for, we think, by James Arrowsmith, a member of the elite, the merchant elite who ran Bristol. It's a perfect example of how statues don't tell us history. They are not a delivery system for the past. They're a way in which our ancestors chose to memorialize people that they chose, often for highly political reasons. In this case of Colston, to do with the power of the merchant elite and the power of a certain bunch of high church Tories who were religious bigots. So this idea that we learn history from statues, I think a lot of people have learned and can see for themselves from what they've learned about Colston that just isn't true.
Thank you very much. Sunder, from your research and from the work that your organisation is doing about this year, do you think there's something which has made this more pointed this year from our condition?
Well, I think why now is an extraordinary coincidence of different factors. We've all had too much thinking time on our hands in a pandemic, and that other debates about identity, history and race were already bubbling up and have been there for a long time. But what this reminds us about is that identity matters, that symbols matter, that history matters, and people care deeply about it. This is an old country, this is an old city with deep roots, but part of that is that the ethnic diversity of this city and this country has deep roots too. It's not something that sometimes our national narrative sort of implies we've been grappling with for half a century since the Enoch Powell speech, or for 3/4 of a century since the Windrush docked. It's a much deeper sense, and sometimes the history of London is said to be on a different planet from the rest of Britain, but yet the very diversity of a global London is very deeply embedded in the history of this country, of which it's the capital, which is the history of empire, of decolonisation, of post-war immigration. And that's not a history we know very well. And so one of the things that we're learning is that while we care deeply about our history in this country, people also are worried that they don't know that much about it. Nobody wants to be the generation that breaks the chain and doesn't pass on to their children what it is about our history. But there's very sketchy knowledge of our history. British Futures did a lot of research around the centenary of the First World War. People knew that was a foundational moment, the two world wars, but they couldn't separate the First World War from the Second World War at all. And so actually that centenary was a chance to try and learn the things you thought you should know. When we think about empire and decolonisation, it's incredibly sketchy. I think the starting points. People know there was an empire. They probably know that India was in it, and they've heard of Gandhi and Queen Victoria. And beyond that, we're struggling, actually. If you said to people, but what was the East India Company? What was the Royal African Company? And these are very, very interesting stories about how, it's a commercial enterprise before it's a state enterprise. This is why, in a way, we've sort of forgotten we've had an empire, because we like to think we acquired it by accident. These are fascinating stories about how we became the society we are. So we're having quite a divisive, quite a polarized debate about this, because we haven't gone back to sort out what are the principles of this debate, what are we trying to achieve. I think we are trying to achieve greater knowledge of how we became the society we are, and to write all of the stories into that history. David's probably done more on that than anybody, I think, in my lifetime or in recent decades, to broaden the stories. But people are going to have different views about this, and we've got to create space for a debate that is comfortable about how we feel differently about this, that creates space for debate and dialogue, not where we impose one answer, but in which all of the voices can be heard, not just those who shout loudest. We have a very thin debate about this on the internet and in the media, where people who don't know very much about the history are debating this week's controversy. I don't think we're equipped as a society to debate what statues to take down or what statues to put up until we actually sort out that the history of how we became the society we are should be fundamental, I think, in every classroom. And then we'll be equipped to debate what to do with particular monuments, particular artifacts, put more up, I hope, as well as take some down.
Very interesting. Now, I want to pick up on something which you've almost all of you have talked about, which is, or alluded to, which is the divisive conversations around this. Why is it so passionate? And I recently had a conversation with two individuals who were deeply, deeply upset about this notion that history was being, in quotes, rewritten. And then I heard the phrase, and then suddenly I became very conscious of this phrase being used all over the place, and people becoming extremely passionate about a notion which is quite bizarre, really, in that every time an academic paper is published, every time a museum puts on an exhibition, every time a book is written, history is rewritten all the time, and it's additive and discursive rather than take stuff away from people. So I want to know from each of you is why you think this is divisive. Why are there such passions about this by people who want to defend statues, let's say, remaining? David, what do you think?
Well, I think there's two reasons. Briefly, the first one is because it's being weaponized by politicians, because it plays well in the focus groups, and because the reports back from the algorithms on social media show that it works. It's a divisive issue, and it's a way of forming electoral coalitions by convincing people that broadening British history to include the stories of Black and brown people is a threat to their history and their identity. This isn't happening by volition. This story is being pumped out repeatedly day after day after day in Parliament, in debates, on social media, in newspapers, to try to create divisions, to win culture war points in order to build electoral coalitions. There's no coincidence. But I think there's a deeper reason, and there's a reason why there is that fertility within this argument that's being exploited by I think very highly cynical politicians. That this is a generational issue, and that's at the heart of 2020. Of course, the pandemic changed everything. It turned down the volume on other things that allowed this debate to rise to the top. The murder of George Floyd had a catalytic effect nobody could have predicted. But this is fundamentally about generations. Young people in Britain today, particularly in cities, do not feel the need for history to perform the function that their parents and their grandparents demanded it perform, which is for it to be a place where we go to feel good about ourselves. History in this country is a soft play area. It's a safe space. Ironically, the word that is used pejoratively against millennials. It's a place we go to feel good about ourselves. And if history becomes a soft play area of nice, comforting stories and heroes, you need to remove from it the sharp objects. And the sharp objects are the chapters of the past that are not glorious, that are inglorious, that are not something that we can just paper over and say was wonderful. And there's lots of problems with that. Without those histories, you have a national history that's full of holes and omissions and, frankly, dishonesties. But the other problem is those chapters that you want to take out, the chapters of how Britain conquered the biggest empire in Africa, how Britain was the biggest slave trader in the North Atlantic, how Britain invaded India and made it to the center of its imperial economy. Those chapters are not just critical to everyone's history, they're also our family history and our backstories. And we make no sense Our presence, our role in this story makes no sense if you edit out those chapters. We, as Stuart Hall, the great intellectual, said, we are here because you were there. I am a Geordie Nigerian. That takes some explanation. And there is a history that explains, that involves not just Nigeria, not just Britain, but Sierra Leone and the Saro people, and good and bad aspects of British history, both the British slave trade and the suppression of the British slave trade. It involves the invasion of my ancestors' town, Ijebu-Ode, but it also involves the work of missionaries who, transformed the fortunes of people in the country that I was born in. We're not interested in any of it, because what we want is a comforting story. The big question we have to ask when we look at the landscape, the memorial landscape and the museum landscape of London, is that it is astonishing if you take a step back. What is the biggest story about our country? It is the empire. It is the story of a small country, a latecomer to the great game of colonization that creates the biggest empire the world's ever seen. And we don't have a museum to the empire. That is the astonishing fact of Britain that would astonish any observer who came and thought about what does this country celebrate, what does it not celebrate. That refusal to actually understand the colonial dimensions of our history is at the root cause of all of this. And a generation who's emerged who doesn't want to hide from this history. They're comfortable with it and they want us to discuss it.
Thank you. Sunder, does that ring true for you?
I think the thing about this debate about a culture war, which is actually a rather American phrase that we talk about more every time the Americans are having a presidential election, but has really taken off in the last 4 years, for sure. The thing about a culture war is that everybody says we don't want one, and then everyone says what their opponents should do differently in order to stop it. But nobody ever accepts that actually there are some responsibilities of different sides of this debate to have these debates, pursue our principles, but to diffuse the polarization. And so the right will say, well, the left is saying that all of the statues need to come down. Any statue that doesn't meet 21st century standards has got to come down. Goodbye Gladstone and Disraeli, and not just Colston. And the left says this is this is all a politically driven, made up debate. But there are real differences here about how we engage with the past. I think the common ground comes from saying we are all products of this past. We can't change it now, and we're not personally responsible for it, but we are responsible for our inheritance of how we live with it, what we want to do with it. I'm an Irish Catholic with an Indian name, so I'm sort of a mixed race. My parents are from Gujarat and Cork, because they both came to this country to work for the National Health Service. So I'm obviously a product of the empire and decolonization, but our entire country is the product of that. So we need to say, let's teach this. And then I think the generational divide is a very interesting one, because actually young people prior to these arguments have been less interested in history on the whole, have found it a bit abstract, a bit distant. These controversies can engage young people in history, but people need their starting points. And so I think it's a good point to say, actually, the sharp edges are important, but we should debate them, contextualize them, use them. There's a big middle ground, I think, of the debate about statues. I would be very reluctant to remove lots of statues. I think the case against Colston was a very, very strong one. The way Colston's name dominated Bristol was very, very striking. He wasn't known outside Bristol. And so people didn't know how to have this debate. But it doesn't seem to me that statues of Queen Victoria, who was the Empress of India, or a statue of Clive of India makes it difficult for somebody of Indian heritage to feel British. But you might say, where are the statues that tell the rest of the story? What else can we do? And I think we have a much more divisive debate if it's all about what gets removed. We should contextualize everything. I would like to see more focus on what's missing and what new chapters we should write. It's a rather flattening idea to say that every generation edits all of the choices of every previous generation and decides what we don't want. We shouldn't be celebrating the egregious or the evil, but I think mostly if people had a role in the history of empire, which is the history of our country, we should tell that story better, leave up those statues, but have a deeper understanding of it, unless they were, the most egregious individuals where that was their sole public contribution.
I find it really hard to believe that Clive of India doesn't come under the category egregious and evil, a man directly responsible for a famine, a man who had to defend his greed to Parliament. I think he does. Sorry to intervene. But I entirely agree. My contribution to trying, I mean, I use culture wars not because I feel I'm engaged in them, but I feel I'm not given the option to, which is why I walked out of an interview virtually this morning of somebody supposedly talking about my new book, but just wanting culture war headlines. I wrote after Colston statue that we need to reach out and appreciate that older people in the city I'm talking to you from now, Bristol, were taught that he was a great man. Absolutely, there's a massive middle ground, but we need to remember something else. Removing statues is entirely normal. It happens all the time. There are landscapes of London that have statues in that we don't know what happened to them, as Sharon will know, because nobody, they're in someone's yard, or the stone was used to build a wall. We don't know what happened to them. There are statues removed because the road plan changes and no one can find space for them. There are statues removed because no one can remember who the hell that bloke is anyway, and everyone who knew him is long in their graves. Only now have they become sacred, and the idea that any statue erected by our ancestors, no matter how violent or crazy or genocidal or psychotic the person was, that somehow that's our history, and removing it is a challenge to history. That's a confected idea invented by people who were involved in the culture wars. I'm interested in history, shared histories, being honest about a history. I cannot help but being collateral damage rather than a foot soldier in these stupid culture wars.
Thank you, David. Debbie, how do you see this playing out with the Mayor's Commission for Diversity in the Public Space? I know you're at the start of a journey, so how would you like it to play out?
I mean, I think both David and Sunder have raised some really important points. I think the thing that the Commission itself is not set up to make decisions, so it will not be given that responsibility of determining what comes down or what goes up. That's not its responsibility. What it will be seeking to do is to facilitate this conversation, and also importantly to make sure that those who are unable to shout the loudest are the ones whose views are part of the sort of conversation that we have about our public space. And we've spent an awful lot of time speaking to those in other countries and those in other cities to find out what have been some of the good and the bad about doing this work. And we've learned from New York, for example, in some of the work that they have done in the past, that it's very easy to listen to those who are politically connected, those who have the biggest bank accounts, those who have PR and all sorts of other structures behind them, to try to dominate a conversation about a public space without also listening to some of those smaller communities who definitely don't see themselves represented anywhere, who don't have the engines behind them to really be part of that conversation. So the Commission will make sure that we are learning and listening through lots of those infrastructure organisations who can help us to reach out into all of the communities across the whole of the city, across all 32 boroughs, to make sure that we're listening locally to what it is that people in different parts of our city want. And the other thing that I think is also incredibly important is that when it comes to putting up and putting down, taking down, it's local authorities who have the powers to do that. And ultimately, they are the ones who have the power and the responsibility to commission. And so what we want to be able to do is to support them to be able to do that. We saw what happened in Hackney, and I think it was really interesting that Dominic talked about the Museum of the Home, and that did not go well. Therein was a consultation in which the views of local residents and individuals were not finally taken into consideration. But as David pointed out, political motivation stopped a lot of what could have happened proactively in that certain situation. But the other thing that I think it's really important to add is that, I think the issue that we have in this country, so this is not restricted to London, is that British history has been poorly taught. I was never taught about the history of slavery. I was never taught about the empire. I was taught about kings and queens, and I learned about the Second World War. I can't tell you how many times, but I never learned that my surname is not my own surname, and that belonged to my family's slave master somewhere long far away from me, sitting happily in a classroom in southwest London. And so I think that we need to do better by by our young people. We need to have a better curriculum. But the reason why you've got so many people getting caught up and being protective of what they think is their own history is because they were taught that the history that they are seeking to protect is theirs, and that actually it doesn't need to include us or anyone else from any other part of the empire. So I think that those are some of the problems which might be leading to some of those divisions that we're seeing today.
Thank you. So why don't we go to some of the questions from our audience? And this one leads directly from what you were saying, Debbie. So Deanne Rowe asks, what particular role can the GLA play in ensuring that we learn about the statues as part of the curriculum, as well as removing them?
So that's a super question. We just during Black History Month, we worked with a very small organisation called the Black Curriculum, who have been setting about trying to help London schools to redevelop their history curricula for young people. I think one of the important challenges that we have is that we have an education system in this country in which you don't really have a national curriculum. You have a national curriculum that you can adhere to if you are a locally maintained schools, but there are very few of those left in the country. We have lots of academies who can follow their own curricula and do as they see fit, as they are semi-independent. And so we can only do as much as we can to try to work with schools, working with different boroughs, certainly in London, to try to get boroughs to work with their local schools, family of schools, to think about better ways of reorienting their history curricula so that it better reflects the diversity within our city. I think when it comes to the statues, I think the issue for us is that we've become almost statue obsessed. So I think it's really important that we do try to, where we can, learn more from those statues. But I think, as David was pointing out, the statues that we have do not necessarily reflect our historical past. And so if we're going to teach a better history, a more inclusive history, it can't be one that's focused just on those statues which are not telling the full story. It has to be something which learns from those historians that are writing really important, interesting bits of work that we need to get into our classrooms so that our young people can learn directly from our experts.
Building on from that, Ken Whitaker asks, to what extent does the current focus of contested legacies on statues distract from the more fundamental issues of institutional racism within a society still rooted in the imperial project? I'm sure you've got a lot to say on this, David.
Well, I'm always nervous of distraction arguments, because whenever any argument is made about Black history or about racism, there is a what about this, what about that. I'm sure that's not the sentiment of the question, no. But I'm very much nervous about distractions, because you can hold more than one issue in your mind at the same time. I think there's a bigger point. It's not just that the statues we've got don't represent our history. Statues cannot tell us our history because they are acutely incapable of performing that role. History is fluid and mobile and plastic. Statues are literally immobile. They're set in stone. They are able to tell us heroicizations of people. Heroic statuary of individuals is about the worst delivery system for history you could possibly imagine. And also, and this is where I always offend people, they're really boring. We don't care about statues most of the time. We just walk past them, we barely notice. There's a simple thought exercise that I often use to try to demonstrate this. The most important memorial landscape in the United Kingdom, and certainly the most important in the City of London, is Trafalgar Square. There are 7 statues in Trafalgar Square. How many can name all 7? How many of us can name all 7? All of us know one of those statues. We can't, because no one cares about them, because they're boring. They're a bunch of old kings and generals and admirals that we don't care about. Nobody comes out of Trafalgar Square saying, well, now I've learned everything about Havelock and Napier and Beatty and Jellicoe, because we don't look at those statues. We don't use them as a mechanism for telling history because they are acutely ill-suited to doing that. The only time the statues of Lord Napier and Lord Havelock have ever been in the news since the moment they were unveiled in Trafalgar Square was when Ken Livingstone suggested not demolishing them, destroying them, putting them in museums, but just moving them. so we can have more room for stalls and for street performers. And that was the end of the world. You had that classic sign that you know you're in a crazy position of people Googling something to get offended, looking something up to try, they accuse the left of grievance archaeology. The moment you mention a statue, people are online trying to work out how they're going to defend some genocidal general or psychotic admiral. They are just not very interesting. So I think you can care about this debate about our built environment and care about structural racism. I like to think I managed to, wear both those hats at the same time. There's nothing mutually exclusive, but statues, they cannot, by their very nature, they cannot tell us history.
So let's think about some other forms of memorializing, or not even memorializing, perhaps recognizing. And in this day where we name things after sponsors and supporters, Jack Brown asks, where do we place the contemporary naming of sports stadia or pieces of London's transport infrastructure after the nations that sponsor / fund them in this debate? And could we be creating a similar situation to that of today's statues for the future? Sunder, do you have a view on this?
Yes, I think being more creative about what we're doing, really, what are we trying to do? I think we should be saying, what stories should everybody know? Whose stories? Individuals are a good way into very complex global history. So individuals matter. You also need the structural argument. And how can we do that? And some more statues might be a good thing, and it's right to debate statues. The Royal Mint has now decided that they're going to, for the very first time, have Black or Asian Britons on coins. That has never happened before. It was a campaign that I was part of. The We Too Built Britain campaign was aimed at the Bank of England, say maybe a banknote. The Bank of England was not very interested, but the Royal Mint has decided to do this with coins. Now, it's the process now that I think is most important. If there was an invitation, I don't think people have heard yet that there is going to be an invitation, or there has been, whose story should everyone know? The process of that debate in schools is much more important than who actually ends up on a coin, which 4 or 5 people do, because we get to hear stories. The story of Noreen Yat Khan is somewhat well known now because good books have been written or programs made. Probably nobody knew it 5 years ago. It's not a very famous story. It could be a really famous story. Arthur Wharton, the first Black professional footballer, was also the fastest man in the world, played for Sheffield United in the 1890s. It's just not somebody that things have been named after in Sheffield or anywhere else. So I think just having a debate about who is not recognised, not remembered, who needs to be, would be a really positive way to take this. The big story that I would like everybody to know and think about is the fact that the world wars are our sort of foundational narrative that we return to, comfortably or uncomfortably. But the armies that fight the world wars, they look much more like the Britain of 2020 than they do the Britain of 1940 or the Britain of 1918. What's that about? Well, it's 10 million men from all over an empire. It's an imperial story. It's another story about empire and decolonisation. It's a complicated story. Indian soldiers are trying to earn dominion status or earn independence. They're very disappointed the first time. They achieve it in a way the second time. They're very differently treated to West Indian RAF men, who are very differently treated to African soldiers. So if we knew that story, it's both part of the story we most cherish when we're wearing a poppy every November, that we should remember everyone who served, and it's a way in to these more complicated, sharp edges of our history. So there, I think, why doesn't everybody in our schools know the story of the armies that fought the world wars, and what were they doing, and why were these world wars? There's a real bridging there, I think, between a conservative desire that we should know the history of this country and the desire of an emerging generation to say all of our stories should be part of that history. And we'll still get some disagreement, but I think we can start to sketch out a much deepening of this debate that we're missing.
And kind of building again from everything you've all said. An anonymous attendee has asked, what role does the panel think that new statues of individuals should play in London's public realm? I mean, is there still the case, given what you said, David, about statues can be a kind of, lots of them, quite frankly, are boring. Once they're out of a kind of, or if they relate to anybody who is beyond the memory of someone who's alive, they become almost irrelevant. Should we stop putting up statues at all?
I mean, I kind of think we should. On the thing about notes and coins, I mean, I think it's ironic that we've got to this point just as money becomes defunct, because I think we're not going to have currency after this. I also love the fact that the campaign to put Mary Seacole on the £50 note. I've never, ever in my entire life been actually permitted to spend a £50 note in a shop in this country without the security guard being called. So there was an irony. She's the only person who to have a black person on the £50 note was pretty ironic.
Yeah.
I think statues are defunct. Yeah. I really do. And they're problematic. I mean, historians will always think this. Even statues of people, that we celebrate, like Mary Seacole, there's lots of problems with that statue. I'm really pleased. It's the first named black woman in Britain. I'm really pleased. But there's lots of historical problems with that statue. There's lots of historical problems. If you honestly look at the documents, which is my job to do, with our understanding of Mary Seacole, I don't think it helps us if we challenge the one-sided mythological tellings of white imperialists, and then we put up one-sided mythological tellings of black figures. To go back to Trafalgar Square, what is the most effective, most important memorial in Trafalgar Square? It's the empty fourth plinth, because it's plastic and dynamic, and it reflects our society of changing ideas, of challenging ideas, not any of the said 7 dead white blokes. This is an ancient form of memorialization. We've got incredibly touchy and sensitive about it in a way our ancestors weren't. The Romans would just cut the head off a statue when someone was out of fashion, or everyone in their family had been killed in a palace coup, and put the head of the new bloke on, because they just weren't so oversensitive about them. I think it's a very strange, dead form of memorialization. I'd much rather see we had bursaries named after people, that we try to make some social difference. It's not that I hate statues. It's not that I think they're always irrelevant. They can be great. But the one thing that's almost never said in these debates, and this is really telling, is we must defend them because they're great works of art. Because most of them really aren't. Most of them are naff. Colston, no one said, oh, it's a great work of art by a fantastic Victorian sculptor, because it wasn't. It was an average work of art by an average workaday producer of municipal confections. They're not great. They don't tell us very much about our past, and they certainly don't inspire us the way art does.
I agree with you. And the ones that are really good pieces of art are notable because they really stand out.
Think about the Angel of, if I'm sorry, may interject again. Think about the Angel of the North. I'm from Gateshead, where that is. We literally love that. If that was a statue of Lord Armstrong, who was the local magnate, the arms manufacturer, it would just be another statue of a Victorian bloke with mutton chops with a very dubious backstory. It's symbolic. It's creative. It's by one of our greatest artists. That's what we need to be doing, is giving that money to our artists to interpret, to make us think, to not say, here's someone you've never heard of, you must revere him, and ignore the terrible things he did. Statues are terrible.
Another one of our viewers, audience members, have kind of has highlighted the irony of talking, as we've said, about a very old ancient technology, statuary or commemoration through statuary, and here we are talking about it actually and debating it through new technology. And so how can we deploy that new technology? And maybe, Debbie, there's a new policy for the Mayor of London: no more memorial statues. But then what will you do, David, when somebody wants to put up a statue of you? What are you going to do?
I'll remind them that, like everybody, I'm terribly flawed. I might have an awful dark side that'll come out after my death, and you shouldn't take a risk.
I think there's
pull it down.
Exactly. And
I still think there's a case for some statues. I think David's right about a lot of statues. Statues work in their context. There are loved statues in this country around football grounds, because you've got Shankly and Dixie Dean on Merseyside. You've got the 3 Degrees in West Point, you've got Bobby Moore outside Wembley. It makes sense in that context
in
and in
sport
that
and
place.
art, it's great.
The Millicent Fawcett statue in Parliament Square is really important. That should be in Parliament Square because it fills a gap. So we do need a statue of a Black abolitionist somewhere to do a bit of the work of recognition, I think, that has been missing. But we should move beyond, it's all about statues, to doing more things. But statues in a context where it matters, where it relates to an institution, I think it can still tell a story about something we want to celebrate that we've neglected to do so.
Fantastic. Just before we end, because we are in the final moments, in fact, we've almost ended, final moment. Do you feel hopeful or exhausted, or perhaps even both by these conversations? Debbie, hopeful, exhausted?
I'm going to say both, because I've worked on race equality for a long time. And so some of these discussions that we're having currently are discussions that I had 10, 20, don't want to give my age away, 30 years ago. But I am hopeful, because I've got to say, and I'm just taking it away from statues just for a moment, the Black Lives Matter protests just opened up the discussion around not just statues, but also around racial and social justice in a way that many of us that have been working in those spaces for a long time had really not been able to achieve. And I'm really hopeful about what it is that we can do next in the given moment that we're all currently experiencing. I've listened to people who have said, it's really pointless to talk about trying to get rid of things like structural racism or, trying to solve poverty. I think the problem with those sorts of opinions is that it removes hope from people. It means that those of us who are living in one of those protected characteristics or are living in a state of financial distress will think that's how it's going to remain forever. And I think that I feel very hopeful that we're able to have a conversation which has been global and has really fired up the imagination. So I am hopeful. I also think there needs to be just a statue of David because I just think that's really cool. So I think I might just suggest that.
Railing and arguing in a gesture like this.
Sunder, are you hopeful?
I think we should feel energized by this. It's an overdue conversation. It's in prime time now. It's been going on for a long time. It is difficult. It is dangerous sometimes in its divisiveness. If we do it properly around what should we all know about our history, there's much more common ground than we sometimes hear. So let's do it properly, find the common ground, but accept that, some degree of division and difference is part of the democratic debate about our identity and our history.
David, have you left this conversation more hopeful?
I think Sunder's entirely right. And I think what British Future has achieved around the First World War should be the model going forward for identification of middle grounds and shared stories. But I'm certainly reserving any judgment about pessimism or optimism, because we're 24 hours away from an election in America that is such an enormous piece of the jigsaw puzzle that, ask me on the morning of 4th of November, or maybe 6 months later when the lawyers finish. I think that huge event is going to determine how we think about 2020 and whether this was a year of change or a year of entrenchment.
Thank you. On that note, and as somebody who comes from an Irish-Swedish background, what this has done for everybody has helped us really think into ourselves. Where are our own individual roots? And that then I think is a really powerful conversation for everybody in our society and for London itself. London's an amazing place, and if we keep on using our institutions like our museums and drawing on evidence, for me that is the most powerful tool we have to keep the debate alive and valuable and valid. So thank you all, everybody. Let's see what happens to London's public realm statues or not. And we'll all be looking at you, Debbie, to see what you do. Cheers. Thank you, everybody. And thank you all the participants as well.
Yes, thank you so much. That was a great discussion, really, really invigorating. After this, we're going to have a networking session available in a separate Zoom meeting that should be in an email to all participants. So you can join that if you'd like to talk about what we've heard today, which I certainly want to. On the public realm and making it more inclusive, we're having a session on that on Wednesday, and we're having a special address on Black Lives Matter in London on Thursday. So watch out for those in your inbox. Thank you again to our sponsors, major sponsors, Corporation of the City of London, L&Q and Uber, supporting sponsors, London Councils, London Legacy Development Corporation, London Property Alliance, the Greater London Authority, Primera and Trust for London, and our exhibitors, Commonplace and the Port of London Authority. Our final session this afternoon is going to be a really exciting look at one of the great works of urbanism from the past 10 years, Triumph of the City, and that will be starting at 5:30 p.m. London time. So thank you so much, everyone. We will see you then.